on in the championship. Chapter 14, The Great Potato Chip Flameout. The failures of Pumpkinhead, versions 1 through 2.3, weighed heavily on Leon as he entered the science lab. It was all fine and dandy to undertake rescue and repair, but unless he could master the third R, reanimation, the whole salvage operation would provide no payoff whatsoever, and Lumpkin would keep behaving like Lumpkin. "Okay," Mr. Sparks chirped. "So we've learned about the importance of classification, right?" "Right," the class shouted. "And we've analyzed all the qualities a potato chip can possess, right?" "Right." "Wrong," Mr. Sparks shot back. "There are tons we haven't considered." "Like what?" said Thomas Warkowski. "Well, have we asked ourselves whether any or all potato chips can burn?" "Duh," said Lumpkin. "Of course potato chips burn. Everything burns." "Duh" and "of course" are terms scientists tend to shy away from, said Mr. Sparks. "I think Henry's wrong," said Antoinette Breed. "If chips could catch on fire, grown-ups wouldn't let us near them." "Some parents don't," said Flossie Parmigiano. "Sorry to break it to you, girls," said Thomas Warkowski, "but Henry's right. Chips do burn. I mean, think about it. Potato chips are food, right? And all food is energy, right? And all energy burns, right? Therefore, potato chips burn." "Except potato chips aren't food," said Flossie Parmigiano, "at least not according to my dad." "Flossie and Antoinette are right," said PW. "Who ever heard of a potato chip catching fire?" He grabbed a bag and looked it over. "I don't see anything on the label that says, 'Warning, keep away from flames.'" "Seems to me class opinion is pretty divided," said Mr. Sparks. He walked over to the blackboard and wrote. Hypothesis number 1. Potato chips are flammable. Hypothesis number 2. Potato chips are not flammable. Whenever a scientist is faced with two contradictory hypotheses, it is often best to confront the problem experimentally. Mr. Sparks reached under his bench and pulled out a pair of safety glasses. "Well, what are you pyromaniacs waiting for? Grab eye protection, tie your hair back if it's long like mine, and gather around." Once the whole class was properly goggled, Mr. Sparks placed a sturdy ring stand on his bench top and fitted the stand with an alligator clip. Let's see. Perhaps we should start things off with one of these green tea chips from Bangkok. You'll forgive me, PW, if I don't say the full name. "No problem," said PW. Mr. Sparks plucked a green tea chip from the bag and gingerly clamped it between the jaws of the clip. He then pulled out a box of safety matches and, without fanfare, struck a match. Everyone watched as he placed the match underneath the chip. It lit up like a candle. "Booyah!" Lumpkin yowled, gyrating his rump like a running back, showboating after scoring a touchdown. "I welcome enthusiasm," said Mr. Sparks, "but before you get too excited, Henry, perhaps we should see if other chips generate the same illuminating reaction. After all, proving a hypothesis requires repeatable results." Mr. Sparks removed one of Flossie's salt-free, low-fat kale chips from its recycled paper bag and clipped it in place. He struck another match and directed the flame under the kale chip. It smoldered and blackened, but refused to catch. "Hey, wait a minute," said Lumpkin. "That chip must be defective." "Let's try another from the same bag," Mr. Sparks said calmly. He repeated the procedure. Again, the kale chip refused to ignite. "Maybe the first chip was defective," said Lily Matisse. Mr. Sparks removed another green tea chip, clamped it in place, and struck a match. Once more, the chip caught on fire, producing a steady yellow flame that burned for nearly a minute. "So what can we conclude?" Mr. Sparks asked the class. "That not all chips are created equal," Leon suggested. "Correct," said Mr. Sparks. "But what's making my chip fireproof?" asked Flossie Parmigiano. "Ah," said Mr. Sparks, "if I answered that question, you wouldn't have a chance to set all these chips on fire. Now, break into groups and test the flammability of the chips we classified last week. See if you can isolate the variable that explains why some chips burn like bandits and others only smolder." Mr. Sparks outlined the procedure. "Take a chip from each bag, burn it, or try to, and write down your observations. The height and color of the flame, the brightness, the duration. You can measure the burn time using that big old wall clock above the door." "No, we can't," said Thomas Warkowski. "That clock's busted." "In that case, share your watches," said Mr. Sparks. "The point is, analyze both the data you gathered today and the data collected last class. And one last thing, keep good records. Lab notebooks often hide secrets that only reveal themselves later." Within minutes, the group were announcing their results. "Orange chips burn better than yellow chips," said Flossie Parmigiano. "Sour creams burn better than plains," said Antoinette Breed. "Crinkle cuts light up more than non-crinkle cuts," said Lily Matisse. "Anyone want a barbecued barbecue chip?" Thomas Warchowski called out. 30 minutes and a box of safety matches later, the group all came to the same conclusion. Kale chips were the only ones that were flame-proof. "So let's address Flossie's question one more time," said Mr. Sparks, holding up a kale chip. "Why is this chip different from all other chips?" "How are we supposed to figure that out?" Lumpkin grumbled. "By thinking scientifically," said Mr. Sparks, "by analyzing the collected data." Thomas Warchowski ventured a guess. "Is it because they're salt-free?" "You tell me," said Mr. Sparks. "Justify your reasoning." "Well, I checked my notes from last week. Only one chip is salt-free." "That's not true," said Leon. He knew the ingredients of all the chips by heart. "You must be reading the chart wrong." He ran over and grabbed the Wall Street blue chips. "See, Antoinette's chips are salt-free too, and they burn like paper." "Let me see," said Thomas Warchowski. He read the label. "You're right," he said glumly. "No salt." "Don't be too hard on yourself, Thomas," said Mr. Sparks. "I keep telling you guys, mistakes are often the scientist's greatest ally. Take space travel. Every time NASA sends up a rocket and something goes wrong, they convene an FRB. That stands for Failure Review Board. Many of the greatest developments in the history of modern aeronautics have emerged from FRB meetings focused on errors. Check through your notebooks and see if you can find the key variable affecting flammability." For a few minutes, the only sound in the lab was the rustle of turning pages. "I've got it," yelled Flossie Parmigiano. "I know why my chips don't burn. It's because they're low fat." "Justify the hypothesis," Mr. Sparks said formally. "Well, I double-checked my notebook and all the bags. Kale chips are the only ones that are low fat." "Hey, that makes sense," said PW. "In 4th grade, we learned about tallow candles, and tallow's a kind of fat." "Well done," said Mr. Sparks. "You have very ably found the key variable that explains why low-fat chips are flame-proof. Fat is indeed an excellent source of energy." Leon leaned over and whispered to Lily Matisse, "Maybe that explains Lumpkin's bully power." "The flame," Mr. Sparks continued, "indicates that fuel is present. That's what generates an exothermic reaction, which is a jazzy way of saying that heat has been freed." The bell rang. "And that's the school's way of saying it's time for us to be freed," PW wisecracked. "Not so fast," said Mr. Sparks. "Let's wrap things up. What have we learned?" "That Flossie's chips burn as bad as they taste," said Thomas Warkowski. "I suppose that's true," Mr. Sparks acknowledged, "but I'm searching for a broader conclusion." Foot tapping, knuckle cracking, and stool swiveling spread through the lab. "I'll put you out of your misery," said Mr. Sparks. "We've learned that scientific knowledge is cumulative." Flossie combined classification and experimentation to solve the stubborn mystery of the flame-proof chip. By doing so, she showed us that breakthroughs often piggyback on past discovery. "Now scram." As the fifth graders were filing out of the lab, Mr. Sparks stopped them in their tracks. "Hold on," he said. "I almost forgot. A good scientist always puts things away." The news prompted widespread groans until Mr. Sparks reached into his bag of chips and said, "Anyone want to help me get rid of this extra research material?" There was a stampede back to the teacher's bench. The fifth graders devoured the chips that hadn't been set on fire. One student, however, chose not to assist with cleanup, despite a deep-felt love for deep-fried tubers. Leon resisted the feeding frenzy because he was too busy chewing over Mr. Sparks' comments about experimentation, about reviewing failure, and about the methods best suited to unlocking a stubborn mystery.